Today we're looking at another example of twin films. Both of these movies are about the planet Mars, and they both came out in the year 2000. Mission to Mars and Red Planet. Now, if you haven't seen either of these films, please stop this video now, go and watch them and come back to me. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe, hit the big red button, and give this video a thumbs up and share it if you can. It's very much appreciated. Now, we'll kick off with Mission to Mars. That came out first. I always thought this was the weaker film of the two. Not by much, mind you. Despite having a better story, I felt the execution of everything in this film was just really lackluster. It stars Gary Sinise, Tim Robbins, Jerry O'Connell, Don Cheadle, Connie Nielsen, Jill Teed, Kevin Smith, and Armin Mueller-Stahl. The first crew of a manned mission to Mars suffer a catastrophic failure when they encounter a giant sandstorm that kills 3 of them. Don Cheadle's character survives, so the second crew are sent to rescue him. And there's a face on Mars, and they figure out how to enter it, and they meet a really poor CGI alien who shows them a planetarium-type animation of the history of the planet. After an asteroid struck Mars, the aliens left, they seeded life on Earth, and it's all kind of shoehorned into the movie too quickly at the end. Like the script was trying to tell a bigger and more meaningful story than it was capable of. Brian De Palma directed the movie, but I think his talent really couldn't shine through here because the script was just awful. The characters are believable, but they're just a bit bland and uninteresting. The film opens with a backyard barbecue with astronauts and their wives, and I think this whole opening is trying to emulate something like the energy of Apollo 13, in terms of the romanticized vision of the all-American apple pie, beers and barbecue, Cape Canaveral / Houston NASA astronaut culture and lifestyle, if that makes any sense. The dialogue is immensely cringe in places. The astronaut jargon and pilot banter seems to be trying to emulate films like The Right Stuff and Apollo 13, but it just doesn't work. And some of the lines in this movie, like, "I'm a good stick man. Have a great ride. It was a go-no-go kind of mission. Let's work up a mission plan. I know the protocols for a Mars recovery mission better than anybody. I designed them. You know and I know he's still the best we got. And he and Maggie wrote the book on Mars. He has more hours in The Sims than the rest of us put together. Come on, people. Let's work the problem. Run the numbers. Okay, we're ready to light this candle." It's all so cliched and occasionally wince-inducing. And just like with Red Planet, in Mission to Mars, there's an emergency when they approach the planet and they have to leave their ship. And Tim Robbins' character of Woody is stranded in space, and he's going to die anyway because he didn't manage to latch onto the satellite that they were chasing. So he's floating away, and his wife, who's on the mission as well, she tries to save him. So he takes off his helmet and kills himself in space so that she won't come any closer. And it's the way it's all done, it's almost laughable in an ironic way. So she's crying and Gary Sinise's character is like, "It's no use. Come back, Terry. He's gone. Come back. We need you." And she's like, "No." And the music is very weak and cheesy, and the whole scene is just eye-rollingly cringe. It doesn't feel sad, it's just overly melodramatic to the point of nauseating. Now, I do like Tim Robbins and Gary Sinise, but their performances in this film just feel a bit wooden and stiff. There's nothing they could do with the horrendous, hammy and clunky lines of dialogue they were given. Gary Sinise just comes across as a bit bored throughout the whole movie. But I do appreciate that he finally got into space in this movie because he was snubbed in Apollo 13. Remember? His character had the measles. But in this film, he just came down with a very bad case of extreme eyeliner. I don't know what was going on there. Now, like I say, the musical score is quite bland in this film. It has a hokey, schmaltzy quality to it by the end, like something from a 90s animated Disney movie. Throughout the film, the ham-fisted, heavy-handed exposition masquerading as natural conversation is just awful. "You washed him out. He washed himself out. He only had to pass a few more psych evaluations, but he refused to take them. His wife was dead. He didn't want to lay on a couch and share her with strangers." As for Gary Sinise's character, his wife is dead. She died off-screen. before the events of the movie. So the film opens with a few sentimental scenes of him and his friends talking about her and mourning her passing, and it's kind of designed to show you that these guys are really close buddies, but the chemistry isn't really there. The banter, the cliched, playful ribbing, the witty pilot repartee, the bonding, it's kind of forced. And as I say, there's a lot of exposition being crammed into the conversations in order to explain things to the audience. Like everyone in these opening few scenes are explaining everything about each other's lives and backstories in what are supposed to be normal conversations, but it's just too obvious. Exposition has to be more careful and subtle than this. Instead, it feels like a blunt instrument. It makes their dialogue feel a bit laboured. Anyway, after the party ends, there's no rocket launch. It just cuts to the Martian surface 13 months later, and the first crew are just there on Mars, which is disappointing because it diffuses the build-up and anticipation of the journey to Mars. So the positives about this film, the characters are maybe a bit too weak and bland, but they are believable and professional enough. Don Cheadle's character does go a bit loopy, having been stuck on Mars alone for so long, but that's understandable given what he went through. Most of the visual effects are brilliant in this film. Great action set pieces and brilliant CGI, with the exception of the awful alien creature at the end. At least the story is a positive one. This is what I call a pro-Mars movie. It's positive about Mars exploration. The aliens are good guys. The message is that we stand on a new world and look beyond it to the next one, that life reaches out for life. So that's a complete contrast to Red Planet, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, there was clearly an attempt to achieve a kind of 2001-style grandiose conclusion, but it's just too rushed to work. The mystery is solved too quickly, and Gary Sinise's character of Jim just goes off with the aliens, and he flies off into space, and we see some flashbacks in the film and shots of his wife, and they're designed to try to evoke some emotions in the audience, but it just doesn't work. Even the final scene, the final moment in the movie, is just facepalm cringe. Jim's ship flies off into space with the aliens, and Don Cheadle says, "Have a great ride, Jim." The end. The film tries to give us a cerebral and thought-provoking conclusion, but there's no real depth or substance here. Jim's whole personality and defining characteristic seems to be, I'm the guy whose wife died. Everyone else is largely phoning it in. The film was really let down by the script, which had been written prior to Brian De Palma coming on board the project. Mission to Mars brought in $111 million at the box office, from a budget of $100 million. We move on now to the stronger film of the two, but the one with the weaker story. Red Planet is a better executed film. The CG in places hasn't aged well, though in some places it's still very good. But the location shooting is far better. Mission to Mars was mostly studio-based, with some location shooting in the Canary Islands, whereas with Red Planet, a significant portion of the film is shot on location in southern Jordan and the Australian outback. As a result, the scenes on Mars look a lot more believable and dramatic. The film is also paced far better, and the characters are more larger-than-life, memorable and charismatic. They're also quite generic for a sci-fi action movie. They are not believable as astronauts. When you're dealing with such extremely technical and dangerous work as going into space, the last thing you want is a bunch of assertive, argumentative, individualistic hotheads, which is what we have with the crew in Red Planet. The crew in Mission to Mars are more believable as astronauts because they respect each other, they follow the chain of command, and work as a team. Astronauts have to be people with a high degree of agreeability and emotional control. It might make the characters in Mission to Mars a bit boring, but it does make them more realistic as professional astronauts. But in Red Planet, the crew of Mars One feel like they're a ragtag group. They treat each other like they're in high school. Tom Sizemore's character of Birchnell is a sleazy, self-absorbed kind of guy. Benjamin Bratt's character of Santon is a total narcissistic, antagonistic bully who would never have passed the astronaut training and psychological evaluation program. He would have been found out as being unable to motivate and inspire subordinates. I mean, he bullies Simon Baker's character of Pettingill. Santon is not a team player. He's arrogant, hostile, and quick to anger. He wouldn't have made the cut. But he works as a character if you're looking to create arbitrary tension and drama in a generic action sci-fi film. Carrie-Anne Moss plays Bowman, and I think she does a very good job in this movie. I think from a perspective of human emotion, she really is the heart and soul of the film. Terence Stamp has a very small role. His character is killed off too quickly, but he had great potential because he was focusing on the philosophical and spiritual side of space exploration. And finally, we have the main character of Gallagher, played by Val Kilmer. They nickname him the Space Janitor, the joke that gets old very fast. And he does work well in the movie, but as a protagonist, he's a little bit too laid back for my liking. So the Earth is dying, and they have to go to Mars to establish a colony there. Once again, just like with Mission to Mars, there's an emergency when they arrive at the planet. Now, Red Planet is the cooler movie in my opinion, but it is all style and no substance. Great visual effects, better location shooting, better acting, more engaging characters, even if none of them are suited to being astronauts, and the film has a much better soundtrack. Brilliant tracks on there: 1,000 Years by Sting, Montauk Point by William Orbit, The Tower That Ate People by Peter Gabriel, and several tracks from Graham Revell's fantastic score for the film. Red Planet also has better pacing, a more dramatic final showdown, and at least the dialogue is better, and some of the jokes work. Now, of these two films, if you're looking for the one with the stronger story, it has to be Mission to Mars. If you're looking for a purely popcorn, brainless action movie that's more of an enjoyable thrill ride, then it's Red Planet. It is truly a brainless movie. It's riddled with scientific inaccuracies. The ship is hit by a gamma burst. That's what Santon calls it. And then Bowman says it's a solar flare. Well, which is it? Well, if it's a solar flare, fair enough. But a gamma burst would kill them all. And wipe out all life in the solar system. Also, these aliens they find, these bugs, Birchinall calls them nematodes. These do not look like nematodes. Nematodes are actually microscopic round worms. And how come they can eat human flesh? How did they evolve to do that when there are no animal life forms on the planet? How come these aliens can also eat metal? I mean, it's a wonder they haven't eaten all the rocks and devoured the entire planet itself. What's even more dumb is that they've eaten the algae sent to Mars and somehow turned it into oxygen so that the crew can breathe on the surface. It's utterly ludicrous. None of it passes the suspension of disbelief test. But hey, neither do Fast and Furious movies. It is ultimately a survival story, the formula being a sci-fi take on a ragtag ensemble of characters who get picked off one by a deadly threat. Essentially, it's like trying to get off a desert island, with a countdown at the end for a dramatic effect. But this is the opposite of Mission to Mars. It's an anti-Mars story because the planet is presented as being too hostile and fraught with danger to consider colonizing. I mean, Gallagher's last words before escaping in a Russian craft are, "F this planet." Not exactly an inspiring message. The film even has the requisite robot that goes nuts and starts killing people trope. However, Red Planet, like I say, is dumber but cooler. I prefer the visuals and cinematography in Red Planet, which is surprising because the film is directed by Anthony Hoffman, and this is his first major big-budget Hollywood action movie, and I don't think he's done anything like this again. Whereas Mission to Mars should have been more visually and stylistically interesting because it was directed by Brian De Palma, but it just feels very pedestrian to me. Anyway, Red Planet made just $33 million at the box office from an $80 million budget. It was a huge commercial failure. So, which film would I recommend? Well, they're both bad movies. I think also this will divide people in the comments. I think maybe 50-50, I suspect. Half of you will prefer Mission to Mars, the other half will like Red Planet. If I had to choose one, I'd probably choose Mission to Mars, but only because the story is stronger. But I do find myself way too distracted by the bad writing, the cringe dialogue, bland characters, and also it feels like there's no urgency in the story. It just sort of fizzles out at the end. And at the end, the characters are all filled with awe and wonder at finding the aliens and everything, but the audience is not sharing in the same experience. Instead, you're sitting there thinking, how did this film get greenlit? Red Planet is equally as abysmal, but for different reasons. It is, at least, a bit more cinematic looking, and with better action and pacing. Regardless, Both films are poor. Now, at the time, there was a big appetite for films about Mars. Pathfinder had only gone to Mars back in 1997. Unfortunately, neither film capitalized on the excitement for Mars back then. And this is where I'm going to take you on a little personal story. Because, dear YouTube viewer, I had a life before I met you. When I left college in 2003, I wanted to do a short film on Mars, especially because the rovers Spirit and Opportunity were about to land there. And so I chanced my arm and I called NASA and asked them if I could use some of their archive footage. And what happened was, I ended up speaking to a lovely lady by the name of Bobby Faye Ferguson. She was working in multimedia for NASA in their headquarters in Washington, and she was very kind and extremely helpful, considering I was just a young fella out of college. So she got me clearances for footage, animation, and images, and then she also said I could come to NASA and film interviews with some of the senior NASA technical people working on Spirit and Opportunity. And she got me some of the top brass. So I flew over there with some money that my father gave me, and I filmed these interviews, and I came home, edited the thing together. I did the voiceover, which was really melodramatic when I look back at it now. I directed it, and another friend of mine who was living in New York at the time did some second unit shooting for me in New York City, just for some nice, interesting cutaways. And with the help of another friend at the time, we produced some additional CGI using 3D Studio Max. The CG we made was pretty basic. It's sort of animatic quality, but it worked. Now, what was extraordinary was that I sent it to RTE, which is our national public broadcaster here in Ireland, and they bought it from me. And it wasn't very much money. I actually made a massive loss on the film. But it was called From Red to Green, The Future of Mars. And it was about the two rovers, but it also went further into the colonization of Mars and the terraforming of the planet, because I was fascinated by the idea of making Mars like Earth. And so it aired on RTE television on February 2nd, 2004 at 11:35 p.m. I even kept the RTE guide from that date. So it wasn't a very good slot for it to air at, but needless to say, I was on television, so I was very happy with that. But it was a hell of an experience. But it feels like a different universe ago. Anyway, Bobby Faye Ferguson made it all possible. And before she worked in NASA, she'd been an actress. She'd been in the likes of Evening Shade, Designing Women, Remington Steele, Dallas, Dukes of Hazzard, The Fall Guy. After she left NASA, she took a role with the Department of Homeland Security in the Office of Multimedia. And I only just discovered while writing the script for this video that she passed away 2 years ago in 2022. She was 78 years old, so may she rest in peace. At any rate, that was my Mars story, which I wanted to include. I hope you liked the video. Let me know your thoughts on these two movies in the comments below. Which one would you prefer? I'll catch you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.